Sakyamuni is the founder of Buddhism and one of the greatest philosophers in world history. His doctrines have not only deeply influenced the society and culture of India, but also continue to have a profound impact on hundreds of millions of people around the globe thousands of years later. Sakyamuni experienced a huge transformation in his life, from a noble prince to a monk for spiritual cultivation, and eventually became the spiritual mentor of countless believers. His thoughts are profound, and his ideas are unique. Especially his understanding of life, suffering, and liberation still occupies an important position in the fields of Buddhism and philosophy. The real name of Sakyamuni is Siddhartha Gautama. He was born around 563 BC in ancient India, in the area of Lumbini, which is now in Nepal. At that time, India was in an era full of changes and collisions of ideas. Various philosophical and religious thoughts emerged one after another, and the social structure was also changing quietly. The birth of Siddhartha was undoubtedly one of the important events in this historical context. His father, King Suddhodana, was not only a ruler, but also a respected king who was dedicated to promoting social prosperity through governance and political means. Siddhartha's mother, Queen Maya, was a virtuous woman. Due to her gentle and refined manner and high moral integrity, she was deeply admired by the people of the kingdom. Unfortunately, Queen Maya passed away shortly after Siddhartha was born, which was the first major blow in Siddhartha's life and brought him profound emotional trauma. His stepmother, Mahaprajapati, took on the responsibility of raising him and tried her best to provide him with a loving growth environment. Mahaprajapati not only cared for Siddhartha, but also set good examples by demonstrating excellent moral character and wisdom. Although Siddhartha lived in a luxurious and carefree environment when he was young, these warm, nurturing experiences deeply shaped his sensitivity and thirst for knowledge in his personality, and also sowed the seeds for his future path to enlightenment. At birth, Siddhartha was endowed with extraordinary symbolic significance. According to historical records, a sage predicted that Siddhartha would become either a great leader or a world-renowned teacher. To prevent Siddhartha from taking the path of becoming a religious leader, King Suddhodana kept Siddhartha in a golden cage in the palace. He tried his best to prevent his son from coming into contact with the outside world, believing that if Siddhartha could maintain a pure mind, he would inherit the throne and continue to maintain the power and glory of the kingdom. However, fate is often beyond complete control. Even though the palace had high walls and a rich collection of books, Siddhartha could never suppress his curiosity about the outside world. Life in the palace did not fully satisfy his deep inner longing. Although he learned various profound knowledge under his father's arrangements, mastered disciplines such as poetry, medicine, astronomy, and practiced archery and tactics, becoming a talented young prince, he always felt an indescribable emptiness. There are many mythological legends about Siddhartha's childhood and history. Although most of these stories are symbolic contents added by later generations, they can reflect Siddhartha's extraordinary and refined temperament. For example, it is said that he could stand and walk when he was born, and wherever he took a step, a lotus flower would bloom on the ground. These myths not only show his innate uniqueness, but also symbolize that his future path would be different from that of ordinary people. As Siddhartha grew older, his father, King Suddhodana, began to arrange a marriage for him, intending to bind him further to worldly responsibilities and power through marriage. At the age of 16, Siddhartha married his cousin Yasodhara. Yasodhara was a beautiful and virtuous woman and was deeply loved by Siddhartha. Her beauty and nobility made her an ideal spouse for the prince. Marriage was a normal step arranged by the royal family in that society at that time and was a political and social responsibility. Although the marriage seemed harmonious and happy, Siddhartha's heart did not truly find peace. Whenever he indulged in the luxurious life, he always felt a sense of inexplicable loss. This sense of loss did not stem from material scarcity, but from profound questions about the meaning of life. He began to see that his life was like a carefully arranged stage play. Although it looked glamorous on the outside, it was empty inside. Meanwhile, Siddhartha's family life also gradually underwent subtle changes. Although he and his wife Yasodhara loved each other deeply and had a son named Rahula, this warm family life did not bring Siddhartha permanent comfort. He began to immerse himself more and more in his inner pursuit, ignoring the various trifles in family life. Although the birth of Rahula gave him some new sense of responsibility, this sense of responsibility did not make Siddhartha put down the questions and pursuits in his heart. Yasodhara, as a virtuous wife, was well aware of the confusion and uneasiness in Siddhartha's heart. She did not force him to accept worldly responsibilities, but silently supported him, allowing him to freely pursue the voice in his heart. Although there was a deep emotional bond between her and Siddhartha, she also understood that true love was to understand and respect the other's inner needs, rather than forcibly restraining the other's freedom and pursuit. During this period, Siddhartha was not only a husband and a father, but also a philosophical explorer who began to think about the meaning of life. His mind gradually detached from the appearance of family life and began to move towards a more profound goal, finding true inner peace and wisdom. The inner struggles and contradictions in this stage laid the foundation for his future path to enlightenment. During an accidental trip out of the city, Siddhartha witnessed three painful scenes in life: an old man walking slowly with a bent body, a sick person moaning in pain, and the corpse of a dead person being carried across the street. These three phenomena deeply touched Siddhartha, and for the first time, he physically felt the impermanence and fragility of life. These ordinary yet painful scenes shocked him, and he began to realize that no matter how wealthy, young, or healthy a person was, he or she could not escape the fate of aging, illness, and death in the end. These symbols of suffering old age, sickness, and death made Siddhartha realize that the core issue of life was not how to obtain wealth and splendor, but how to deal with the impermanence of life and death and the universality of suffering. He understood that what he was pursuing was not material enjoyment, but liberation, liberation from suffering and the shackles of death, and finding a kind of wisdom and freedom that transcended life and death. These discoveries made his inner confusion even more urgent, and he could no longer ignore his questions and the call of his heart. These seemingly accidental events were actually the crucial moments in his fate. After that, Siddhartha began to deeply reflect on his own life. He was no longer satisfied with the luxury and ease in the court. The call in his heart grew stronger and gradually formed a firm determination. He wanted to find a path that could liberate him from suffering and transcend life and death. His life was no longer confined to the palace and family, but was eager to break through these numerous shackles and explore broader truth and wisdom. At the age of 29, Siddhartha made a decision to leave the palace and seek the path of liberation. He chose to leave the palace quietly on a moonlit night, instead of bidding farewell in front of his father and wife, because he knew that the significance of his trip far exceeded all family responsibilities and social obligations. Siddhartha's departure marked his complete farewell to secular life, and also meant that he was about to begin a spiritual cultivation journey full of challenges and trials. When leaving the palace, he took only a horse, a piece of clothing, and a firm belief. There was no fear of the future in his heart, only a strong desire for the true meaning of life. Siddhartha traveled through jungles and over mountains, alone, and began his long journey to seek wisdom and enlightenment. The decision to become a monk was not a momentary impulse, but an inevitable choice after Siddhartha's profound reflection. For him, giving up the throne, leaving his wife and children, and severing ties with his family were not due to boredom with the material world, but because he deeply knew that only by finding the truth within could he truly get rid of the various sufferings and impermanence in life. This was a path that required courage and sacrifice, but he was already ready to face all of this. On this journey, Siddhartha was not alone. Although he gave up his family and kingdom, he did not completely break away from social connections. Along the way, he met all kinds of people, including poor people, ascetic monks, and ordinary people who had no understanding of the various sufferings in the world. He communicated and interacted with these people, and gradually realized that different life choices and experiences brought different understandings and wisdom to people. But he knew that the wisdom he was seeking did not belong to any traditional ideological system. It transcended secular dogmas and originated from deep inner enlightenment. The early stage of spiritual cultivation was not smooth sailing, but full of hardships and challenges. Siddhartha did not have a clear set of spiritual cultivation methods in his mind. He could only rely on his intuition and the longing for inner enlightenment to find the path that could lead to true wisdom and liberation. During this process, Siddhartha came into contact with many different spiritual cultivation methods, especially the ascetic traditions of Hinduism at that time. Ascetics firmly believed that through extreme self-torture, they could purify the desires of the body and the distractions of the mind, thereby achieving liberation. They thought that only when the body and mind endured extreme pain could it be possible to attain supreme wisdom. Siddhartha got acquainted with 5 ascetic monks and became their companion. The 5 ascetic monks were all spiritual cultivators who pursued spiritual liberation. Their lifestyle was extremely simple, and they tortured their bodies in various ways, believing that this was a process of purification and elevation. Siddhartha began to join them and practice these extremely harsh ascetic ways. The most common ascetic practice was fasting. During this period, Siddhartha hardly ate anything and only relied on a small amount of water and some grass leaves. His weight dropped sharply, his body became very weak, his skin was dull, and his face was haggard. In order to eliminate the desires of the body, he also refused any form of comfort, sat for a long time, and even did not take shelter in extreme weather. In order to achieve self-control and mental concentration, he carried out various self-tortures such as abstaining from sleep. Whenever his body felt extremely uncomfortable, a strong desire would arise in his heart, that is, to transcend the shackles of the flesh and completely get rid of pain. However, although Siddhartha tortured himself extremely, he always felt that his heart had not truly achieved liberation and enlightenment. The pain of his body once brought him close to death, but this pain did not bring the light of wisdom. Instead, it made him fall into deeper confusion and bewilderment. Even though he once felt the power of self-purification, the final effect was only to make him weaker and more tired and lose his inner peace. After a long period of extreme torture, Siddhartha finally realized that extreme asceticism was not the path to liberation. Although this method could eliminate the desires and cravings of the body, it did not touch the real root of the heart. Pain did not bring him enlightenment, but made him sink deeper. Although he had tried all extreme ways, the confusion in his heart had never been resolved. At this time, Siddhartha began to question the existing spiritual cultivation methods. He realized that pain was not the only way of spiritual cultivation. True wisdom was not obtained by torturing oneself, but by awakening the mind and clearly seeing the true meaning of life through inner clarity. He began to think whether there was a more balanced and moderate spiritual cultivation method that could neither indulge the desires of the body nor force oneself into extreme torture. So, Siddhartha decided to change his way of spiritual cultivation. He began to try to give up extreme asceticism and instead pursue a middle way of spiritual cultivation. The concept of the middle way did not simply refer to a certain form of spiritual cultivation, but was a wise choice neither indulging in extreme pleasure nor forcing oneself through extreme asceticism. He realized that true wisdom and liberation came from the balance and enlightenment of the mind, not from extreme forms of the outside world. The shift from extreme asceticism to the choice of the middle way marked his in-depth thinking on the true meaning of life and also paved the way for his future enlightenment. After a long period of asceticism and meditation, Siddhartha gradually realized that only through inner enlightenment could one truly be liberated from the sufferings and impermanence in life. He gave up extreme asceticism and chose a more balanced path of spiritual cultivation. However, he knew that he still had not truly touched the core of wisdom, and the true meaning of liberation was still unresolved. So, he decided to seek a deeper level of meditation and self-understanding. Finally, Siddhartha came to an ancient Bodhi tree in northern India. This tree was regarded as a sacred symbol and a place where countless spiritual cultivators sought enlightenment. Under the shade of the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha chose a quiet place and decided to spend a period of in-depth meditation here, vowing to find the true meaning of life and achieve complete awakening here. He sat quietly, with his legs crossed, his body in a stable posture, his eyes slightly lowered, and his gaze focused on his inner self. At this time, he no longer cared about the pain of his body or was bothered by any external distractions. His goal was inner awakening, truly understanding the suffering and liberation of life. As the meditation deepened, Siddhartha's state of mind became clearer and clearer. He entered a state of deep self-observation and began to pay attention to every subtle change in his heart. Gradually, his heart was no longer troubled by distractions, and all emotions and desires began to dissipate, replaced by a state of tranquility and serenity. He felt that his mind was sublimating to a higher level. At this time, Siddhartha's heart suddenly became clear. He realized that the suffering of life did not come from external forces but from the desires, ignorance, and attachments deep in the heart. The reason why people suffer is that they are full of attachments and greed for life and cannot see the impermanence and changes of all things. Desires make people insatiable, and attachments make people unable to be liberated. Whether it is the pursuit of power, wealth, or the desire for physical pleasures, it will make people trapped in endless cycles of suffering. And true liberation is not to escape from suffering or to eliminate desires through extreme spiritual cultivation, but to transcend all attachments and find inner peace and purity. Only through true enlightenment can one see through all illusions and get rid of the sufferings and shackles in life. During the deep meditation, Siddhartha finally realized the four truths of life, which were later known as the Four Noble Truths. Dukkha, all lives are in suffering, whether it is physical pain or inner pain. The essence of life is full of hardships. Samadaya, the root cause of suffering lies in human desires and greed. Whether it is the craving for materials or the uneasiness about life, all suffering stems from the ignorance and attachments in the heart. Nirodha, suffering can be ended. By abandoning desires and attachments, people can transcend the cycle of life and death and achieve inner peace and liberation. Magga, the path leading to liberation, is the Eightfold Path, a middle way that neither deviates from extreme pleasure nor relies on extreme asceticism, but achieves inner purity and wisdom through correct thinking, behavior, and spiritual cultivation. During the process of enlightenment, Siddhartha not only understood the suffering and impermanence of life, but also knew how to move towards liberation through the correct way of spiritual cultivation. He realized that all the sufferings and confusions were because people couldn't see the true features of things and were bewildered by ignorance and desires. And the key to enlightenment was to view everything with the eyes of wisdom, let go of the attachments and desires in the heart, and then be able to transcend the sufferings of life and achieve true peace and liberation. Under the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha's heart achieved complete awakening. His state of mind was no longer disturbed by the outside world, nor was he troubled by any form of desires. He saw the truth of the world and understood the true meaning of life. He was no longer just a prince or an ordinary spiritual cultivator, but became a fully enlightened Buddha. After enlightenment, the Buddha didn't choose to live a solitary life, but decided to pass on the wisdom he had comprehended to the world. He deeply knew that if no one heard these truths, the path of liberation couldn't be truly spread widely. The Buddha decided to embark on the path of preaching and missionary work and began to spread the Dharma, guiding the lost people towards enlightenment and liberation. The Buddha first returned to the 5 ascetic monks with whom he had practiced together before and told them the truths. He had realized the 4 noble truths and the Eightfold Path. He told them that extreme asceticism was not the path to enlightenment and that true liberation didn't come from self-torture, but from correct spiritual cultivation of the mind, wisdom enlightenment, and inner peace. He explained the suffering of life, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path leading to liberation. These doctrines didn't fall into the extreme of suffering, but provided people with a middle way path of spiritual cultivation. The 5 ascetic monks were shocked when they first heard these doctrines. They finally realized that the path the Buddha had realized was the true path to enlightenment. The 5 ascetic monks wholeheartedly accepted the Buddha's doctrines and began to follow him in spiritual cultivation. The Buddha and they together started the real Buddhist missionary career, which also marked the birth of the Buddhist monastic community. The Buddha's missionary career began, and he started to travel all over India to spread the Dharma. Although the Buddha's doctrines were based on profound wisdom and the understanding of the truth of life, he never forced his doctrines on others. Different from traditional religious leaders, the Buddha didn't proclaim his divine status, but emphasized that everyone could find the path to liberation through their own spiritual cultivation and enlightenment. During the process of spreading the doctrines, the Buddha didn't choose to rely on temples or scriptures, but passed on the wisdom of the Dharma through direct communication with his disciples. He taught the Dharma to believers in an easy-to-understand way by telling stories, using metaphors, and giving direct instructions. His explanations were full of profound philosophy, while also showing compassion and tolerance. The Buddha's words deeply moved countless people. Whether they were poor people, princes and nobles, or scholars and monks, they could all find answers in the Buddha's doctrines and obtain comfort and guidance from them. The Buddha's disciples began to spread all over India. At first, his disciples were mainly poor people and those of low castes. However, as the Dharma spread, more and more people began to join the Buddhist ranks. Even many nobles, kings, and Brahmins were attracted by the Buddhist doctrines. The Buddha's disciples were not limited to a certain class, but came from all levels of society. Through the Buddha's teachings, believers were no longer restricted by the traditional caste system, but believed that everyone could obtain equal enlightenment and liberation through spiritual cultivation. This idea of breaking the boundaries of social classes became one of the core values in Buddhist doctrines. Throughout his life, although the Buddha didn't force anyone to follow him, he was generous in spreading his wisdom and guiding all those who are destined to walk on the path to enlightenment. His disciples continued to inherit his doctrines, spreading them not only in India, but also to China, Southeast Asia, and even as far as Tibet and Central Asia. When the Buddha was alive, he didn't record his doctrines in written form, but spread the Dharma through oral explanations and the inheritance among disciples. After the Buddha passed away, this oral inheritance method became the key to the continuation of Buddhist doctrines. However, as time went by, in order to avoid the loss or misinterpretation of the doctrines, the Buddhist disciples began to sort out the Buddhist teachings and doctrines into scriptures and pass them down in written form. At first, these scriptures were sorted out by the Buddha's direct disciples and some senior monks. The initial parts of the Buddhist scriptures were mainly orally transmitted scriptures and precepts, such as the Lotus Sutra and the Agama Sutra. These scriptures covered the Buddhist doctrines, the methods of spiritual cultivation, the contents of precepts, as well as various metaphors and stories, helping spiritual cultivators better understand the Dharma and put it into practice. With the spread of Buddhism and the continuous growth of the monastic community, more and more scriptures were sorted out, translated, and compiled, forming multiple Buddhist scripture systems. Different Buddhist sects began to sort out scriptures according to their own understandings and practices, and finally formed different scripture systems such as Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes the Bodhisattva path and advocates helping all sentient beings achieve liberation through compassion and wisdom rather than merely seeking personal enlightenment. Its ideological system is more inclusive and emphasizes the great ideal of delivering all living creatures from torment. The scriptures of Mahayana Buddhism, such as the Avatamsaka Sutra and the Prajnaparamita Sutra, have expanded the original teachings of Buddhism by incorporating more philosophical elements and social concerns. They advocate popularizing the Dharma to enhance the spiritual level of all sentient beings. Compared with Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism pays more attention to personal liberation and emphasizes achieving liberation through self-effort in spiritual cultivation and the inner enlightenment of the cultivator. Theravada Buddhism maintains the Buddha's original doctrines and precepts and believes that only through thorough inner spiritual cultivation and enlightenment can one reach the state of nirvana. The main scriptures of Theravada Buddhism include the Pali Canon, and it emphasizes the practice of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Apart from Mahayana and Theravada, the development of Buddhism in various countries and regions also gave birth to other sects and doctrines, such as Vajrayana Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. The formation of these sects and doctrines is not only the result of Buddhist culture adapting to different social needs, but also reflects the flexibility and inclusiveness of Buddhist doctrines. The spread of Buddhism is not limited to the inheritance of doctrines and scriptures. It has deeply influenced the whole society and culture. The core concepts of Buddhism, such as compassion, wisdom, and selflessness, have gradually permeated all aspects of social life. From art, literature to politics, education, Buddhism has left deep marks in many fields. Buddhism emphasizes equality and non-self, which makes it a relatively open and inclusive belief system. Especially at the intersection of multiculturalism, Buddhism can effectively coexist with other religious and philosophical thoughts. In addition, the concept of respecting the environment and compassion in Buddhism has prompted many Buddhist countries to adopt more moderate social policies in history, advocating charity and social welfare. With the spread of Buddhism around the world, its doctrines have not only influenced the cultures of India and Asia, but also permeated the Western world. In modern society, the philosophy and spiritual cultivation methods of Buddhism are still receiving more and more attention and have become a spiritual resource on a global scale. Sakyamuni's life was full of changes and legends. After experiencing the huge transformation from a noble prince to an enlightened mentor, the Buddha didn't stop spreading the Dharma in his old age. Even though he was old, the Buddha still deeply influenced the world by spreading the Dharma, guiding his disciples, and continuing his educational career. Although he no longer influenced the world with physical activities, the wisdom he taught continued to shine brightly in the hearts of his disciples and later believers. The Buddha emphasized the importance of the concept of impermanence by telling about the impermanence and suffering of life. He often reminded his disciples that life and all things were in constant change, and birth, old age, sickness, and death were inescapable natural laws. Only through spiritual cultivation could one transcend these sufferings and achieve inner peace and wisdom. When the Buddha was 79 years old, he realized that his life was coming to an end. In his last few months, the Buddha began to explain the Dharma to his disciples more frequently, especially the doctrines about impermanence and liberation. Although his physical condition was gradually weakening, his dedication to teaching and passing on the Dharma never slackened. During the Buddha's last preaching, he especially emphasized the importance of nirvana and told his disciples that whether in life or outside the cycle of reincarnation, true enlightenment and liberation were to transcend all the sufferings of life and death. He pointed out that through enlightenment, people could break away from the cycle of life and death and reach the final state of nirvana. Finally, the Buddha decided to go to Vaisali, which was the last destination of his life. The Buddha knew that he was about to pass away, so he decided to summarize the doctrines with his disciples here and prepare to face the end of his life. The Buddha's last day was spent in a calm and solemn atmosphere. At the end of his life, the Buddha summoned his closest disciples, including Ananda and Kassapa. His last teaching before passing away was brief but profound. He admonished his disciples that the Dharma didn't rely on the existence of the Buddha, but on the enlightenment and practice of each spiritual cultivator. He told them, all phenomena are in the state of impermanence. All things are conditioned. When birth and death cease, tranquility is bliss. It means that all phenomena are in constant change, and birth and death are inescapable. But through spiritual cultivation, one can finally achieve the state of nirvana, which is a state of tranquility and liberation. The Buddha's parinirvana took place in a quiet place under a sal tree, where he sat down to meditate and deeply entered the state of meditation. At this moment, his body gradually became calm and serene, and finally, he passed away peacefully. The Buddha's parinirvana marked the completion of his mission in this world and also symbolized that the wisdom and compassion he taught would always exist in the hearts of his disciples and influence countless believers in later generations. The Buddha's parinirvana was not just the end of a life. It symbolized the ultimate liberation that transcended life and death and all troubles and sufferings. Although the Buddha left this world, the wisdom, compassion, and power of enlightenment he taught would always exist. The Buddha's parinirvana represented his spiritual completion. He no longer needed the existence of his body to continue his work because his doctrines had already taken root in people's hearts and would exist eternally in the hearts of all those who pursued enlightenment. Sakyamuni's life was a process of continuous exploration and continuous awakening. He transformed from a noble prince into a great mentor, and his doctrines have guided countless people on the path to enlightenment and liberation. Although he never claimed to be a god, he was close to the divine realm in spirit. His wisdom, compassion, and selfless dedication will always be precious spiritual wealth of mankind. That's all for today's video. Thank you for watching. If you think this video is informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. See you in the next video.